Hello and welcome to the SSP Scholarly Kitchen webinar, The Future of Independent and Scholarly Publishing. I'm Jeff Lang, your host and chair of the SSP Webinars Working Group. On behalf of SSP and the webinars team, we'd like to thank our sponsor today, RedLink. Our 1-hour session will begin shortly and participants' lines have been muted in consideration of our speakers. This moderated session is being recorded and the video will be posted on the SSP website 60 days after this broadcast. Our moderator today is Phil Jones, a scholarly kitchen chef and a publishing professional who has worked in editorial, outreach, scientometrics, consultancy, product and technology in such places as Jove Digital Science, Emerald Publishing. Phil volunteers on the SSP Annual Conference and Organizing Committee and the STM Association Future Labs. He's also a member of the Reader to Researcher Advisory Board. In a former life, he was a cross-disciplinary research scientist at the UK Atomic Energy Authority and Harvard Medical School. In just a moment, Phil will introduce the panelists and get us started. If you have questions for the panelists or need technical assistance, please use the questions box on the right side of your screen. You can ask your questions at any time, and please remember to state who your question is for. Now here's Phil to get us started. Phil, you may be muted.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Yes, I was indeed muted. Thanks for that great introduction. I will start, as Jeff said, by introducing my fellow panelists. We have a great group today to take you through a number of issues and questions around the future of independent and scholarly publishing. So to start with, we have David Crotty. He's the editorial director of Journals Policy for Oxford University Press. He oversees journals policy and contributes to strategy across OUP's journals program. He drives technological innovation and serves as an information officer. David has previously managed and edited journals for both OUP and Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory Press. He's also a former scientist with an academic career, including both Columbia and Caltech. David has been elected to and serves on the boards of the Society for Scholarly Publishing, the STM Association, and Core Inc. He's also the executive director of the Scholarly Kitchen blog. We also have Karen Wolf with us here today. Karen is a historian of early America and early modern Atlantic world. She is executive director of the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture, which is a funder, convener, and publisher. She's also a co-founder of Women Also Know History. We also have Robert Harrington with us. Robert is an associate executive director at the American Mathematical Society, responsible for publishing activities. Robert is an officer of Chorus and a board member of SSP. Robert is a tennis addict. He bakes cakes, he scratches away at the cello, and is constantly being implored by his children to stop being so childish. At this point, I guess I should say that I asked the speakers to write their own introductions, and that was not me. Lastly, Judy Luther consults with all stakeholders in scholarly communication, providing market insights to inform business decisions. Recent projects have focused on journal launches, journal workflow, and outsourcing options. So that is the panel that we have for you today. So in this webinar, we will be focusing on the future of independent and society journal publishing in the face of shifting economic landscapes, including ever more consolidation, regulation, and economies of scale. We will be asking questions like, how will significant changes to the regulatory environment, like Plan S, for example, affect the sustainability of independent publishers? How can small independent publishers adapt to those changes? Is it even possible to maintain an independent publishing program, or will it be in the future? And should publishers even want to do that? If learned societies and independent publishers choose to partner with larger entities, what are the benefits associated with that, and what are the risks, and how can those be mitigated? Now, historically, the problem of independent publishing sustainability is nothing new. We've been talking about a serious crisis for decades now. I've certainly had many conversations with industry colleagues, tracing this all back to the creation of the big deal, the centralization and greater visibility of subscription costs, site licenses within institutions, and before that to the advent of commercial for-profit publishing itself. But today's webinar won't be a competitive game of it all started when. Instead, we're going to take a close look at where we are, where we may be going, and how to adapt to our present and possible future circumstances. Scale is driving everything in our market today. Bulk buying is resulting in higher margins, and economies of scale are made more powerful by technology. For example, it's cost effective to support your own platform when you can spread that cost across thousands of titles, but it's not practical if you publish less than half a dozen. For larger players, those margins can fund innovative explorations into other parts of the value chain, either by moving up or downstream or creating information products that serve a broader range of stakeholders. Author pays open access also works best at scale for analogous reasons. High throughput mega journals with no print version make more money the more articles they publish. With modern workflow and content management systems, incremental costs of publishing can be driven down. We shouldn't forget, however, that this is a bit of a double-edged sword. As a journal's reputation increases, the volume of lower quality submissions increases faster than higher quality submissions, making it challenging to maintain quality at scale. Even though this isn't a new problem, recent events have certainly thrown it into sharp relief, most notably the work of Coalition S and the creation of Plan S, including its implementation guidance. The plan may have significant economic impact for the scholarly publishing sector, and with a proportion of those consequences likely to be unintentional. Plan S doesn't explicitly call for author pays gold OA to become the business model of choice. However, with no alternative suggested and 20 years of stakeholder experimentation not creating any kind of better business model, that looks like the de facto position and the only possible route for a lot of journals and publishers. So with that, we'd like to come to the panel to explore some of the consequences and ways in which publishers can adapt. So I have to note at this point that we only have an hour, so we're going to have to be quite strict on time. So you'll forgive me if I have to hurry people along or occasionally cut folks off. But with that, we'll turn to David first. So David, I mentioned in the introduction that there are the potential for unintended consequences for Plan S. In your role at OUP, I know that you spent a fair amount of time working with research societies. Could you talk about the pressures they face and how initiatives like Plan S are affecting them?
Thanks, Phil. So as you just said in your introduction, the issues facing smaller publishers have really been developing over the long term. Plan S is just kind of the latest thing to hit us. Over the last few decades, I think the really big shift has been in the way that journals are sold. Going from selling individual subscriptions to individual researchers to selling site licenses for a journal to a university, and now selling collections of journals to consortia. And that's really put an increasing pressure on independent publishers because these big deal packages lock up a lot of the library's available funds, and they make individually sold journals really sort of prime targets for cancellation when a library needs to save money, because that library will save money by canceling a single journal, but if they cancel a title from a package that it's purchased, they don't actually save any money. Now, on top of that, open access has been with us for nearly 20 years, and that adds pressure because, as you just detailed, the best available business models that we have are all about scale. At the same time, we're seeing widespread calls for cost reductions, and I think it's a mistake to automatically conflate open access with cost reduction, although that seems to be happening a lot. But in the end, if you're a big commercial publisher making a large profit margin, you can survive losing a few percentage points of that profit. But if you're a small publisher barely breaking even, then those few percentage points are the difference between survival and going out of business. So now on top of all these, we'd see this increasing level of regulation of the publication process by both institutions and research funders. And Plan S realistically is a step in a long chain, but it really does very deliberately try to push things forward rapidly by adopting a few more extreme criteria than previous policies did. Particularly the short timeline and the elimination of the hybrid open access model make things really problematic for the smaller publisher. To take a step back from that, in the big picture, publishing is a service industry, and our job is to meet the communication needs of the research community. Coalition S is a representative of part of the community, and they're voicing their needs, and we need to figure out ways to provide publishing support for Plan S authors. Right now, that means a relatively small percentage of researchers. Remember that signing on to Plan S is, less than half of the members of Science Europe have signed on. Sweden has already removed themselves from the plan. US federal funders are not signing on. There's no indication that China is going to do so either. And while there was one positive public statement from someone in India, there has been no official government statement of signing on. So Plan S itself may only represent a small percentage of what you publish, but you should also be under no illusions. It is indicative of the direction of travel. I mean, we are moving into an open access world, and no matter who you are, you really need to get your publication program ready for it. Although I think that direction is set, I also think each field is really likely to come to more openness at its own pace, and probably through a wide variety of different approaches. We don't really have any one open access business model that's universally accepted, or even one that doesn't cause as many problems as it solves. So that means there's going to be this very mixed population of customers whose needs you have to meet. And again, this favors a big publishing program with lots of varied journals publishing under different models, so everybody can then work with you and remain compliant for the rules that they're under. With previous policies, what was really nice is that a hybrid journal could serve a lot of different constituencies, but under Plan S, you would need 2 separate journals to reach the same groups of authors. The timescale for Plan S also makes things difficult. A good way to respond to Plan S is to create some new journals and experiment with some new models. But right now, we're expecting some revised implementation guidelines from Plan S or sometime in mid-May at the earliest. And then after that, each Plan S member is going to have to sort of craft their own individual implementation for a policy. And it's all meant to go into effect at the beginning of 2020. So launching a new journal or even making major changes to an existing journal, like flipping it to open access, takes time. And if you're a big publisher, again, you can bring a lot of resources to bear that the smaller publishers just don't have.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. So before I go on to the next thing I was going to ask you about, a little bit of housekeeping for everybody listening. In the GoToWebinar interface, there is a questions box. So if you'd like to put in any questions, I can read those and I can ask them of the panelists kind of as we get to those. Just wanted to point that out before we move on. So you talk about the challenges around business models, particularly for independent publishers. So I know that a lot of people are experimenting with read and publish models and even publish and read models, whatever the equivalent of that is. So do those offer some relief or some cover or some assistance?
I'm not sure how much relief they offer. I mean, at least under Plan S for the smaller publisher. Remember that read and publish or publish and read deals, they only cover hybrid journals. And hybrid journals are not allowed under Plan S, other than this sort of short-term transition time. But, you know, at least in my experience, those deals really take a long time to negotiate. You need to create a custom deal for each institution or each consortia to meet their needs. And I think by the time a lot of these are in place, we'll be at the end of Plan S's transition phase anyway. But more importantly, they don't really solve the bigger problems that Plan S creates for smaller publishers. So, you know, at best, they may just postpone them. Outside of Plan S, we are seeing increased demand for these sorts of deals, but again, they're hard to negotiate. Libraries are really busy, which means it's hard to get a seat at the negotiating table unless you're a bigger player. I mean, most libraries aren't going to spend a year negotiating a read and publish deal for a society with 2 journals. I think you just have to think of read and publish as big deals more than anything else.
Right, I think we may hear a little bit more about that from some of our other panelists later on in the conversation, how they're dealing with that and how they're coping with that challenge around having a seat at the table. So does this mean, in your opinion, that more market consolidation is likely? You do a lot of negotiation yourself with societies to create publishing partnerships. Can you talk a little bit more about how those would work, what the benefits are, what the risks? We are running a little bit short on time for this, so can I ask you to keep it a little brief?
Yeah, I'll try to go fast. So I do think consolidation is going to continue. Plan S is a catalyst. It's really been a wake-up call for a lot of small publishers. They've sort of seen, well, you know, these things are off on the horizon, and now they're saying they're at our front door. The way these sort of arrangements work, a lot of smaller, you know, publishers and independent publishers go to larger publishing houses and set up a partnership. You send out a request for proposal to a variety of larger publishers. Usually it's very helpful to get a publishing consultant to help run the process for you, because it can lighten your workload, and they bring a lot of experience to bear about, helping you get a good deal and getting your needs met. The publishers will then respond with a written proposal. Sometimes they'll do presentations as well. You'll find one that you're happy with as a potential partner and put together a contract. Contracts usually run around 5 years. They can then be renewed, or if you're unhappy, you can go out for RFP at the end of the term and find another partner. What the smaller publisher gets out of the deal is access to all the resources of the bigger publisher. So you get entry into their big deal, all the sales power that comes with it. Again, as you said, bigger companies get such better prices and have such better efficiencies than the smaller presses, that they can usually reduce costs enough to maintain or even improve the earnings of the society, and then still provide enough additional surplus to make it worth their own while. For the society, that means scale, things like going from having maybe one person working on marketing or sales to having a global team of hundreds of experts. You get access to all the state-of-the-art technology, the publishing platform, submission, peer review systems, and it's all at a vastly reduced cost, because the big publisher can amortize those costs over hundreds or thousands of journals. You get to tap into the analytics, the market intelligence that the big publishers have going on. You get strategy advice, you get support as you try to grow your journals program. And perhaps most importantly, the bigger publisher takes on a lot of the financial risk on behalf of the smaller partner. Often these deals involve guaranteed revenue levels, which allow the smaller publisher to have some stability and sustainability over the long term. The downside to them, which you have to consider, is that you are giving up some level of control. Most smaller publishers and societies, they're used to running their whole ship themselves, and here you are turning over a lot of responsibility to a partner. You'll lose things like, often pricing, marketing, the way things are marketed, some of the policies, some of the production processes. In each deal is individual. A lot of these things are negotiable, but the bigger publishers generally like to standardize everything as much as they can to create cost efficiencies, and that can be a hard adjustment for a society to deal with. And I'll point out one other thing. Mike Clark wrote a really nice scholarly kitchen post called "Navigating the Big Deal," which I highly recommend everyone read. As the big deal has evolved, it's really become more of an arrangement between the publisher and the library. So rather than the journal and the library, no one subscribes to your journal anymore. Right now, the library purchases a package from the publisher. So if your journal moves to a new publisher, the library is still paying the same amount of money for the publisher's package, and now they have to find some new money to almost resubscribe to your journal at the new publisher, and libraries are pretty on tight budgets these days, and that puts your journal almost in a position of starting from scratch with no subscribers in a very tight market. So if you do one of these deals, you need to really negotiate very carefully with an eye towards a potential exit to avoid that sort of lock-in.
Yeah, that's right. Sorry to move things along, but yes, that's a really good article that Mike Clark. There's another one as well that Joe Esposito wrote, which was strategic and non-strategic publishing, which talks about the asset of a journal and the risk with revenue becoming non-portable because you get folded into a deal, and that's the economic downside, I guess.
That's the risk. I mean, I think in general these partnerships work really well if you partner with the right partner and you have a very well negotiated, careful arrangement that can really be win-win. And I think most independent and society publishers should really just regularly investigate what those would look like, just as due diligence, even if you don't intend to do it, just knowing what's out there and what it would mean.
Yeah.
I think really
So a bit of caveat emptor, a bit of due diligence is needed. So let's move on and let's bring in both Karen and Robert into this discussion as society publishers. So Karen, let's start off with you. Why don't you set some context for us and describe a little bit about your publishing program and the organization?
Sure. Thanks so much. It's great to be with everyone today. I didn't realize we were crafting our own biographies with such creative license, or I would have said that I don't play the cello, that my children find me just as aggravating as I'm sure Roberts do, but also that I've been a scholarly kitchen chef since 2015, where I really enjoy the writing and the opportunity to exchange views with people across the scholarly communications kind of industry, and I'm also a board member for Orchid and a great booster and cheerleader for Orchid, so I want to make sure to plug that as well. So the Omohundro Institute is an independent, nonprofit, very, very nonprofit research organization. We're a funder, a convener, and a publisher. We're located on the campus of our founding sponsor, William & Mary, where I'm also a professor, and we publish both a journal independently, and to go to David's point about control, that is, we have done due diligence and investigated going into a larger publishing arrangement, but we have found consistently that there's so many advantages to us in publishing our journal independently, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But we also publish books in partnership with UNC Press, so we sort of have a double arrangement there. We have a partnership with UNC Press for our books, and our journal, we are independent. So we're in a very particular field, early American history. I would argue that it's an absolutely vital field, and right now, actually in this kind of geopolitical moment, it's a really vital field to understand. And we've been leading in that field for 75 more years, actually. So there are things that I will want to say about what we're doing that are very particular to that field and to that discipline. And I do want to emphasize how important it is when we're talking about these general trends, that, you know, every field and every discipline has kind of particular economies of practice, but also kind of ecologies of practice that are really important to pay close attention to. And the kind of the impact of some of these broader plans may seem to hit hardest at something like the humanities, or a small field like mine, or a smaller institute with a smaller publishing program like ours. But I think there are kind of general points about our experience that are useful and interesting more widely. The first of those, I'll just mention two quickly because I know I'm going to be attentive to time here. But the first is that an institute like ours engages in every aspect of the research process. When we're talking about being a funder and a convener and a publisher, what we're really talking about is engaging with our full community of researchers who are our readers as well as our authors. As you know, they're also students, graduate students, as well as faculty. They're independent scholars working outside of the academy. It's our full community that we're engaging with across the research process. And in fact, I think of our work not just as a publisher, but I really think the primary purpose of our work is to bring together scholars to share and provide critical feedback on their scholarship. And the publishing enterprise is just kind of one piece of that cycle of exchange. And it's not even really what I would describe as the kind of apex. It's really a cycle, not a pyramid. The second point is related to this. Our editor, the editor of our journal, Josh Piker, just wrote a wonderful blog piece called The Problem of Josh Piker, which essentially argues that when authors thank Josh Piker for all of his investment in time in their scholarship, when in fact they have not published in our journal, they've been turned down, but they've gone and published somewhere else, but they've benefited from the extraordinary level of feedback that has been provided through our review process, it makes invisible that whole cycle of exchange. And the problem he's pointing to, of course, is not actually himself, but that invisibility of that full cycle of exchange. And I think the point I want to make here is that seeing publication as the key output of our work, rather than critical feedback throughout the kind of research and scholarly cycle, is also really a problem. So we're publishers, yes, but we're publishers because we are supporters of the full research and scholarly cycle.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Ken. That's that's a fantastic summary of what it is that you actually do as a, as I hesitate to say publisher, because the way that you describe the role of, you know, society and convener is much broader than that, and I think that's a very valuable contribution to this whole narrative and thought process around what it is that learning societies do and why it's important that they still have that place in scholarship and in the academy. So with that, I'd like to turn to Robert. Robert, so basically the same question is, could you tell us a little bit about your publishing program and how things are going at the American Mathematical Society?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the American Mathematical Society clearly operates in the discipline of math, or for those of you outside of the US, maths. And we serve around 30,000 mathematicians around the world. And we see a growth in math around the world. So much so that we've launched an initiative called BIG in business, industry, and government, because we see the increased use of mathematics in careers that young people are taking on in business and industry and in government. For us, we do have a significant, what we think at least is a significant publishing program of books, journals, and a database called MathSciNet. We publish around 100 books a year. That's gone up recently because we acquired a book program from another society, which is, I think, a relatively unusual thing to have happened, at least over recent years. So we are publishing around 100, the other society being the Mathematical Association of America Press, MAA Press. And we also, in terms of journals, we are publishing around 24 journals, which range from a couple of member journals through translation journals to a number of very high quality research, what we call primary journals. And then the database is called Mathematical Reviews, and there we actually sell that through a subscription on Consortia, and that is some 3 million plus articles and books with direct links to about 2 million articles in 1,800 plus journals. So it's quite an enterprise, and we have all sorts of other pieces attached to that, such as personalizable author profiles and citation information, etc. We are seeing growth, and we are also seeing very low attrition on our journals. So things are currently going well, and I say currently because there are clearly threats on the horizons as well as opportunities. We do worry. We worry because we generate from the publications revenue of all the various types and models that we have, around 70% of our revenue for the society, operating revenue from the society, comes from our publications. So of course, anything that were to threaten that revenue base is a potential of concern. We also worry about what mathematicians actually want. You know, on the one hand, you see political movement, you see an ideal of openness, which is great, but what exactly does that mean for us as a society as we generate our content for mathematicians? So that's something we really do worry about. We worry about the individual mathematician and what they actually care about as authors and as readers. And we really also worry about our own independence. We have not gone out to the larger publishers to investigate partnerships. And, you know, in the current climate where not only is it a publishing relationship, and in a sense, you're also got a political relationship because of the various initiatives that are out there. By signing up to a larger publisher, sometimes the worry could be that you're also ceding sort of a political, some political space too. So we worry about those things. We also recognize that while we think we are important in our own lunchtime, we are a relatively small in scale when you compare, say, the size of our math publishing output to, say, that of Springer's. So you can these are the things that keep us up at night. And openness, in a sense, is something that we do want to take account of as fully as possible, provided that we do it in a way that's sustainable and that actually caters to the needs of our membership, and also mathematicians more broadly, not just those who are members of the society. So perhaps that's I think that's probably enough from me on that particular question.
Yeah, I think that very definitely gives us a sense of how the publishing program is going at AMS, and also your concerns and interests on how that integrates into mathematics as a discipline and your role. I think we're seeing a lot of parallels here between what Karen's talking about as the role of if you like, a facilitator of the discipline, an overseer of the discipline itself. I think that's a valuable component to the discussion, and one which could very easily get lost in all the talk of business models and products and that sort of thing, and payers and what have you. But just to get into that kind of more detailed space, I want to ask you a specific question, Robert. Not long ago, I was at a conference that you were also at, and you stood up and you asked a question of somebody involved in Coalition S, I believe, about mirror journals. So I wanted to get your take on the sorts of business models that you've been exploring at AMS around publishing, and your understanding of what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's compliant, what's non-compliant, and what's going to work and what's going to be sustainable. That's a kind of a little bit of an unstructured question, but I wanted to give you some leeway to kind of talk about that whole part of the discussion.
So yeah, just focusing on the journal piece, not books at this point, but on journals, I did ask that question at Researcher to Reader. And I think some were sort of frustrated that I had asked that question. Others were saying, thank you very much for asking that question. And it sort of betrays what I saw as a sort of slight lack of real thought from Coalition S itself in addressing how these plans are going to play out. We actually, in terms of the way that we make our articles and journals open, we are fully compliant with Green, but all of our journals are made available freely, not through Creative Commons, but through just made publicly available after 5 years. So that's one thing that we do. Back in 2014, we also realized that we wanted to provide a gold open access option to those who might otherwise feel that they can't publish in our journals. And we thought, this is way before Plan S, of course, so we thought that actually it would be a sensible model to try if we took 1 or 2 of our journals. We ended up taking 2 of our journals, and starting a completely new journal. The new journals do not have impact factors, and in fact they're small enough now still and new enough now that they still do not have impact factors. But the only thing that the 2 journals, or the spin-off journal or the mirror journal, shares with its parent is the editorial board. So we wanted to do this specifically to separate the editorial process from any sense of business. So an author in those cases submits their article to the editorial board, and if approved, if accepted, the author is then given a choice to publish either in the subscription journal or in the open access journal. Coalition S determined that this was akin to being a hybrid journal, which I think logically it really isn't. But I think there was a sense that if this were to be something that was generally adopted, it might be a loophole and a way around some of the plans that Coalition S was keen on implementing. So it's a bit frustrating for us because we saw this as an entirely sort of ethical approach to addressing openness and separating in the author's mind business from editorial completely. And so we didn't start it for those reasons. I can understand that it could be seen as a loophole, but that wasn't the way we went about it. So we're interested in looking at various different business models. I really, there are some intriguing options out there. I think the subscribe to open model is actually sort of intriguing. And I can get into that a little bit later, or I can tackle it now. I suppose just quickly on that, subscribe to open, for those who don't know what it is essentially been something launched by the annual reviews, or in the process of launching by the annual reviews, where libraries subscribe to the content, to the journals that they have, and if all the libraries continue to subscribe, those journals are then made open access. It requires on a complete subscriber base to continue subscribing to do that. Personally, I think this is a really interesting option because what happens is from the library's point of view, you have to separate out the cost of purchasing from the ideal of open access. And this is something that societies potentially could look at more closely, because most of the society journals that are published are at a much more reasonable cost to libraries than perhaps the commercial ones are. I don't want to get into comparative costs, but that would mean that it be possible to separate out the ideal of openness from cost. So that's something we're looking at. We are not very keen on publish and read publish. And from a Plan S point of view, only about 25% of our authors are directly funded by a funder. So we don't see Plan S directly touching us, but we do see a worry about the confusion in mathematicians' minds as they are faced with different paths in Europe, different paths in the US, and potentially the rest of the world. We are putting a lot of burden potentially on authors. So one of our key drivers for any business model that we tackle is to reduce that burden on the author, or to minimize burden on the author. We are also looking at platinum, and platinum, I think, is a really interesting way to go if one can afford to do it. One has to raise funds. I mean, by platinum, I mean that it's free to publish in and free to read. And to do something like that, one has to do it in a way that recognizes the real costs of publishing a journal, and therefore significant funds need to be raised. In our case, we have significant funds, and we also have access to potential donors. We haven't explored this yet, but this is another option that is possibly open to us. We haven't made any decisions on that. And a good example of something to look at that I think has been successful is from the American Chemical Society. If you have a look at Central Science, that is an attempt there to really recognize the value of a society's ability to provide openness without putting the burden on the author or the consumer. I could get into publish and read and publish, but I feel like I've been waffling on a little long here.
Well, not waffling, but I do want to bring Karen in on this. So speaking about those kind of business models, publish and read and publish, platinum, subscription to open, so on and so forth, Karen, you publish in a very different area to AMS. How do these models translate into those disciplines? What are you thinking about in terms of what sustainability looks like in the future?
So this isn't a dodge exactly, but I want to address your question about business models by going back to an issue that Robert raised, which is about ethics and values. I think open, yes or no, is often posed as a kind of value. Do you value openness, yes or no? But actually, openness is a kind of value proposition, and it is often open instead of. And what we find is that in our community, there are, and I think actually this goes to the Ithaca report that was just issued this week as well, when scholars are asked whether they value open access, they say yes, but they don't necessarily seek that out as the top priority in publishing. In my community, openness instead of what we're actually offering would not be a priority, which is to say we do a ton to make our work available. Let's be clear, we are so nonprofit, we don't even make back 30% of the cost of the journal. In fact, I think this is one great thing about independent publishing, is that for the benefit of our community and for the public at large, we've been able to make more transparent the real costs of doing this kind of work. But to be clear, for us, the real costs are in labor. You know, people sometimes talk about a journal at the top of its field, even if it's a small field like mine. We are definitely at the top and leading in this field as prestige journals, but I don't think of it as prestige. I think of it as really, it's not like a prestige journal, it's more like a sweat equity journal. We did a study that showed that we spend 130 hours of expert labor, that is apart from the reviewers, to move an article through the review process. That's a really intense commitment to the excellence of scholarship, and more importantly, to the exchange of views. And that is highly valued in our community, because it's actually, in historical scholarship, that kind of intensive, highly skilled exchange is absolutely critical. So that is of higher value than pure open access. And to say, I will say too, that it's also the case that APCs in our community are viewed as entirely unethical for a field for which, you know, research is funded at very low levels. It's often the case that an article could have funding of $500 to $1,000 from 4 or 5 different research organizations. How would you sort out whose requirements for publication are controlling in that case? In other words, it's just really a kind of inappropriate fit. So when we talk about how we're responding to the imperatives here at something like Plan S, it's such a miss for us. And it makes me wish that we could have more and deeper, broader, diverse discussions about values and about relative values across publishing communities.
I want to echo a little bit of what Karen said there in terms of the ethics of the APC, and something that I also neglected to mention is that if you were to ask most, not all, but most mathematicians about openness, they assume that math is already open, because everything that is published, and I would actually say 100% of what actually ends up in our journals is in some version or in multiple versions on the archive, a preprint server called the archive first. So in many ways, mathematicians at least, and they've been operating this way for decades, have sort of seen a continuum, an ecosystem that is already quite open. So it's sometimes a confusing conversation to have. And in fact, I've just written a large 11-page document for our upcoming Executive Committee and Board of Trustees governance to sort of explain some of the things we're discussing here today about all the various models that are out there, what are the opportunities and threats, because it's most mathematicians are going to say, but we're open already.
Yeah. So can I just jump back on that for 1 second, Phil? Is that okay? Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
please do.
Okay. Yes, just to echo that is not to say that we are ignoring the imperatives here of sustainability. That's absolutely key for us. And if I thought, and if we assessed, and if we had an experience of our authors and our readers, and frankly our subscribers as resisting what we're doing here with our very low dollar subscription model, we would respond to it. But as we test and ask and continuing, go back to that community, what we hear from them is that our subscription cost, which is, we have never been able to find a user fee of more than 10 cents per use at any library that subscribes to us. I think the entire UC system gets our journal for under $200. That is literally what we're talking about here. We're really talking about low dollars. We would, think about some changes, but what they're telling us consistently is that monolithic model of open access is not the community's value. Sharing, openness, dissemination, public engagement, all of that, yes, but not the thing that is being described as open access in something like Plan S.
That's yeah. So yes, that's really important. That's a really important point to make about kind of diversity of opinion and so forth. So we are running a little bit low on time. I have one more question for you, Karen, but I need to leave enough time for Judy to come in. We've had a request for more information about subscribe to open model. So rather than kind of discussing that now in the webinar, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a link in the chat for everyone to click on. That is a post by Anne Michael, which is about subscribe to open model as implemented at annual reviews. That's a good information source for those who are more interested in that. So we do have a question from the audience, actually. Is there a good conference for independent publishers to meet and discuss these issues, software use, business model, etc.? Now, I immediately think of SSP when I with that question. But is there any way that you would suggest, Karen?
So I would say SSP, absolutely. And the reason I would say SSP is not just to be a cheerleader for SSP, but because I think it's so important for us to be in conversations, nonprofit, for-profit, larger, smaller. I understand the impulse to want to have a conversation simply among independent publishers, and maybe what we should do is be looking at some panels or some breakouts at SSP, but I think we need to be in these larger conversations because there are things that are not just particular to us that, in my view, larger for-profit STEM enterprises haven't been thinking about enough. And we bring a really important perspective to what they're doing.
I'd like to go to Judy now. There's loads of questions that I still have for you two, but we are running a little bit low on time. We've only got just less than 15 minutes left. So Judy, I'm sure that you've had lots of conversations with societies and independent publishers about the issues of sustainability, and this isn't the first time that sustainability has come up as a question and issue in our industry. So to you, is this a new level of existential threat? Or is this different to past crises in any way? How serious is this? What are you hearing from learning societies?
Certainly, we faced sustainability questions in the past, and it's all occurred in an evolutionary way, from dropping print or dramatically reducing print to adapting to consortia sales. What's different here is that there's a tipping point that could be reached with open content if it spreads widely enough in your particular discipline, that if what might be viewed as, I hesitate to use the word comparable content, but if there is content that will meet the needs of a large number of people, and I'm thinking now globally, the global south, worldwide, as well as in the developed world, then the question becomes at what point are closed content going to be at a significant disadvantage? So you're kind of looking, some societies are both focused on their own discipline and looking more broadly at portions of their discipline that are covered by large commercial publishers who are perhaps, as well as being under threat by Plan S, also in a better position to take advantage of operations at scale. The other thing that's occurring is that there's an evolving conversation, not just about open access, but to open scholarship. I see quite a bit written about open science, but recently I'll give credit to the director of ARL, Mary Lee Kennedy, who is using the term open scholarship, which I like because it includes all the disciplines. And my observation is that big data is affecting disciplines in the social sciences disciplines. It's not just in the hard sciences, where you have massive data sets in astronomy or the life sciences. We even had at a local SSP meeting here in Philadelphia, we had a speaker whose research was on churches, a church that was moved from one coast of Scotland to another in the 11th century. And she was actually using 3D imaging to take a look at the landscape. So I asked her what impact that had on her research, and her response was, well, it made us realize that from the bell tower of the church, you could see the sea, and you'd be able to spot the Vikings and the Vikings and their paths down on either side of Scotland. After the conference, she mentioned that she had a grant to work with other humanities scholars who also were working with 3D in terms of the data sets that they had and how they were potentially going to be able to preserve them, link them to their work, etc. So digital humanities has been active for a long time, but that was a particularly interesting example to me of the extent to which we're all dealing with aspects of scholarship that actually should be part of the scholarly record. And that's a challenge. It's all being available in digital form, so there's an expectation that it will be able to be linked with the DOI and fit into the infrastructure that we have in scholarly publishing, and there are costs associated with that. So it's not just the scholarly article, it's the question of, beyond that, is there a data set that may eventually be at the center of the conversation?
Right, it's interesting. So it's so in many ways, a lot of those new requirements and trends are going to increase the costs of the types of scholarship and the cost of the kind of services that are going to be required. Are you hearing a lot from publishers about that, and how those sorts of new things could be sustainable?
Aha. I don't know that they are prolific enough at this moment in time. I think it's going to vary quite a bit across disciplines. I think the sciences, which have been, life sciences in particular, have been, I won't say most impacted by this, but most visibly affected by the conversations around Plan S and the short timeline mandating a transition. That said, it isn't just a transition for managing this content. It's also the fact that they're being asked to consider such innovations as open peer review and what that means. And that has huge cultural implications. Of course, if it's being driven by the funders, and that has a very persuasive influence. But it's still a cultural adaptation that I'm not sure that we're all quite ready for, and that as desirable as it may be in some areas, it's going to take time for all of that to evolve. That doesn't address the costs associated with this, but I will say that the infrastructure is evolving. Crossref has developed identifiers for peer review. And in addition to that, or DOIs assigned for peer review. And in addition to that, there are identifiers for institutions that are being introduced. So the infrastructure is already being developed to embrace data sets, data site, descriptions of data that can be brought into the landscape and made part of the scholarly record. I think it's as much a matter of working with workflows and the costs of adapting one's current workflow environment.
Yeah, so do you see that as very closely related to concerns about Plan S and the sustainability of scholarly communication in scholarly publishing in a landscape where everything is expected to be open, and many of those research disciplines contain lots of unfunded researchers? Is that very closely linked to these increased requirements in terms of what scholars are going to need? Do you see those two things as a convergence of the same question, or are those two different concepts, or are those two different things that we need to discuss and worry about?
I think there are two conversations that are running in parallel. Plan S has such a short timeline and potentially such a strong impact on the economics of some societies that there's a strong focus there in terms of how do we respond. And in the sciences, there's a much greater impact. But I will note that Plan S has, when you look at the participants, around half of the participating funders fund more widely than science. They fund disciplines across the entire academy. So no one escapes unscathed in this, or without having to develop some alternatives for this particular plan. But the life sciences, again, are being pushed a little harder, I think, than the other sciences or the other disciplines, who will have a little more time to adapt. As Robert noted, there's a fairly small percent of the authors whose papers are accepted in the journals at his organization. And I think that's true for a lot of societies. So the question then becomes, all right, we're going to have to deal with this. What are the best options that we have? And right now, there's kind of the beginnings of an assessment period. It's almost as though there's a collective, everybody inhales and takes a deep breath. And then as you start to exhale and you say, all right, what are our choices here?
Yes, indeed. Well, there's a question from Laura Mullen, a librarian. I'm just going to have to read it, because I've just been trying to read it and digest it down, but it's a little long, so I'm just going to read it out and hopefully we'll see where this takes us. So one question I have about libraries: we are sure of the titles we have to have, and then there's some we don't really have to have. This would be based on cost per use and other data, as well as our selectors know what our selectors know are must-haves. Why is there such a worry about cancellations of must-have high-value society journals by librarians in the wake of Plan S and other disruptors? Librarians would pay for subscriptions that we really need. For the most part, these society journals would not seem at risk. Reasonable cost, high value faculty demand titles still are needed by libraries. For Plan S, then, maybe the subscribe to Open really would be supported for those types of titles. We would seem to be headed for a mixed library collections environment with some reasonable subscriptions, subscribe to Open, SCOUP, 3X type, etc. So would anybody like to jump in on that one?
Sure. This is Robert here, and I mean, that was the reason why.
Sorry, you've got about 2 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll be very quick. But I mean, that was a good. Thanks for the question, and that was the reason why we are intrigued, because we see this as a way that societies can differentiate themselves, or at least I see this as a way that societies can differentiate ourselves from perhaps publishers that have very different cost pricing concerns, and that there is a will to continue to subscribe to high quality society journals at the same time as supporting openness. So there are plenty of risks and probably unintended consequences that need to be thought through from embracing any new model, and including subscribe to open. But that was one of the things that caught my attention. It looks intriguing. So that I support what the questioner says, and I would hope, and we need to do some due diligence if we are going to think about that as a model, by actually talking to librarians, our subscribers, and librarians generally, about whether this is something they would support. There is some sense, I think, that the Coalition S would recognize this approach as acceptable, but I'm not absolutely sure of my words there.
Robert, just a quick jump in. I'd suggest people read the post that Phil put a link to, as well as the comments gets into. There are some issues with the model, but I think in response to that question, to me, Plan S is not about societies getting their journals canceled. That's more about the need of libraries for cost reductions, and in some ways, Rick Anderson has always said, it doesn't matter how valuable the journal is if you don't have the money to pay for it. And if you have a library where you absolutely have to cut things, and you've cut all the journals that are not must-haves, then you need to start cutting the ones that are must-haves. And that's a tough situation for a journal that's outside of these big packages, where cutting something doesn't really help the library.
Indeed, yes, and that's a pretty hard truth that some librarians and publishers have to face when we end up in that sort of situation. So I just have a note from Karen, just to say thank you to Laura for that question. The recognition of a variegated landscape is quite right. So we've got like 30 seconds left, but I wanted to leave the audience with some type of take home. So what is it that people should be doing tomorrow, particularly small independent publishers or Learning Society publishers, when they go back to their desks tomorrow, Judy, what should they do?
I would suggest that they keep an eye on some opportunities arising in the industry to streamline productions and to lower the cost of publishing altogether. XML First is beginning to emerge as an opportunity. There are several vendors who are working on solutions. Some of these have been around and employed by large societies or large commercial publishers for many years. But they will be more readily available in the market. It can shorten time to production and lower production costs. And that, I think, will enable some societies to consider options that aren't now available with the current environment.
Right, so there are ways, looking at your operational alignment, looking at your operations, to try to reduce costs and just basically do good business and good operations. Any last thoughts from any last word of advice from perhaps Robert or Karen?
I would say, I mean, our approach generally is to not panic. There is no need to panic. I think that societies are well placed to be able to provide a balanced portfolio, but embrace openness where it's possible, but realize that subscriptions for content that is valuable and reasonable in cost are still, they're not going to run away. So just not to be panicked. I mean, clearly it depends on different, it's field dependent a little bit, but I would say just be balanced in your portfolio and explore options that look at life that way.
I would just say super quickly that I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're really absolutely of service to your community, most broadly conceived. And when you are, then you'll actually be fine.
Yeah, I'll throw in that same don't panic. And the really positive thing about Plan S is that it has really brought the researchers themselves to the conversation. Previous policies sort of didn't really necessarily, put that much of a change on what they were doing, and now they are actually becoming involved and having their voices heard, which I think is what we all want, and the needs we need to serve are now being voiced, and I think that's a real positive to come out of this.
All right, so don't panic. The conversation is getting better and getting fuller, and there are things that we can look at, and there are things that we can do. So I think that's an excellent point to finish on. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for listening and thank all of our speakers. I'll hand back now to Jeff to thank our sponsors.
Absolutely. For the last minute here, thank you, Phil, for a fantastic job moderating this discussion, as well as to David, Karen, Robert, and Judy for wide-ranging and well-informed chat here. Thank you today also to our sponsor, RedLink. The SSP webinar series takes a break for the summer, but we are back in the fall for our next session, What You Need to Know About Plan S, on September 17th. Please also be on the lookout for our webinar survey in your inbox. We use that information that you provide to continually improve this webinar series, so your input really is important to us. The session is now ended. Please enjoy the rest of your day.